The world's on fire. Our river's gone dry. The rich are getting richer. They've left us out here to die. Mass migration. We got no place to hide. Who's against us? Who's on our side? Are they too dumb or are they just in on it? Liars and cheaters, a red-hot grip. Ditch the gaslighting gas bag that speaks in code. He's a faker, a shaker, a pontificating pantload. In this house of mirrors, we've hit the wall before it's too late. Let's go. Come on, y'all. It's border to border and coast to coast. It's real, it's facts, and it ain't no hoax. It's Podcast by George, and it's showtime, folks. Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Today we've got a good one because it's going to deal with the topics that are very near and dear to my heart, in the forefront, top of mind, as they say. And folks, we're going to be talking about what I liken to the big three on Podcast by George. It's climate, war, and healthcare. And I deal with them usually in that order. And we're going to be talking a lot more about climate on today's show. You're going to find out why. But these things are all interrelated. They're all connected. A lot of it has to do with money and emphasis. I mean, we're spending all of our treasure, blood money on war. We don't have enough money, or we don't understand the money that's required, the emphasis that we need on climate. And we certainly don't understand the connection with healthcare on all three of those things. That's what we're going to be talking about today. The big three: climate, war, and healthcare. And we're going to be joined by a new friend. Let me bring this up on screen. It's Brad Wolf. He's coming up here very shortly. Brad Wolf's a former lawyer, professor, community college dean. He's co-founder of Peace and Action Network, the branch in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He writes for Common Dreams. We're going to have that on screen here a little bit later. I'm going to read some of that. And also World Beyond War. This guy gets it. And we're going to have him on Podcast by George very shortly. And kind of to get us started, before we even bring Brad up here, I wanted to talk about the climate. And again, these things are all connected. People say, God, George, what do you talk about climate all the time for? Well, I'd like to talk about some other things. The name of the show is Podcast by George: News, Blues, and Interviews, but I don't get very many blues on here. I don't ever get to talk about hockey anymore, which is something that I'd like to visit. And I'm not talking about parochial local politics very much, because these overarching big issues, these things that are threatening humanity, have to be discussed. They have to be dealt with. We've got to start voting accordingly. Now, look at this. This is an article just today. Maybe you saw this. This is from the Associated Press. Zombie ice from Greenland will raise the sea level 10 inches. 10 inches? Yeah, Greenland's rapidly melting of the ice sheet will eventually raise the global sea level by at least 10.6 inches. Holy buckets. That's more than twice as much as previously forecast, according to a study published Monday. That's because of something that could be called zombie ice. That's doomed ice, that it's still attached to thicker areas of the ice. It's no longer getting replenished by parent glaciers, now receiving less snow. Without replenishment, the doomed ice is melting from climate change and will inevitably raise seas, said study co-author William Colgan, a glaciologist at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. Quote, "It's dead ice. It's just going to melt and disappear from the sheet," Colgan said in an interview. "This ice has been consigned to the ocean, regardless of what climate emissions scenario we take now. It's going to happen." Study lead author Jason Box, a glaciologist at the Greenland Survey, said it is more like 1 foot in the grave. 1 foot in the grave. Now, the unavoidable 10 inches in the study is more than twice as much sea level rise as scientists had previously expected from the melting of Greenland's ice sheet. The study in the journal Nature Climate Change said it could reach as much as 30 inches. By contrast, last year's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reportedly projected a range of 2 to 5 inches, 6 to 13 centimeters, for likely sea rise level from Greenland ice melt by the year 2100. The figures are a global average for sea level rise, but some places farther away from Greenland would get more and places closer like the U.S. East Coast would get somewhat less. Now, although 10.6 inches may not sound like much, it would be over and above high tides and storms, making them even worse. So, wherever the high tide is, this is on top of that. So, this much sea level rise will have huge societal, economic, and environmental impacts, said Ellen Enderlin, a geosciences professor at Boise State University, who wasn't part of the study. Quote, "This is a really large loss and will have a detrimental effect on coastlines around the world," said NYU's David Holland, who just returned from Greenland, but is not a part of the study either. So I want to wrap this up here. This is the last slide. Colgan responded that the team doesn't know how long it'll take for all of the doomed ice to melt, but making an educated guess. And folks, these folks, they've been right all along, these climate scientists, going back into the 80s and 70s when they first started talking about this. What they predicted is exactly what we're experiencing. So the precedent is set. Believe them. Making an educated guess, it would probably be by the end of this century, or at least by 2150. Colgan said this is actually all a best case scenario, if you can believe that. The year 2012, and to a different degree, 2019, was a huge melt year when the equilibrium between adding and subtracting ice was most out of balance. If Earth starts to undergo more years like 2012, Greenland melt could trigger 30 inches of sea level rise, he said. These 2 years seem extreme now, but years that look normal now would have been extreme 50 years ago. Yeah. Have you had a derecho lately? Have you had a hailstorm lately? Any of this kooky weather that we've had? It snowed here in May a few years ago. That's how climate change. We had tornadoes in March in Iowa. This is the kind of thing that he's talking about. That's how climate change works, Colgan said. Today's outliers become tomorrow's averages. My God. Okay, so let's take that down off a screen here. Click a couple of buttons and get to our guest. I just wanted to start with that because they are all interconnected, and we're going to be getting to that. And I want to get our guest in here, get him on screen here, and click the right button. Okay, here we go. So there he is, and we'll bring him up a bigger screen here. Folks, this is Brad Wolf, as I mentioned. He's a co-founder of Peace Action Network in Lancaster, PA. He's a prolific writer. He's all over the publications that I read and follow, and I'm just delighted to have him on the podcast by George Liveline. Hi, Brad.
Hello, George. How are you? Greetings from Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I've been there. It's been a long time, but I made some sales calls out there back in the day. It is a beautiful part of the country. Now, it's very rural out there in the parts that I was in anyway. Is it still rural, and is it in a drought or a weather crisis like we are here in Iowa?
There are still large sections of it that are rural. The downtown Lancaster City is a city of about 55,000 people. That's where we live. But otherwise, it's rural with a lot of suburban spread. There is a drought going on really to the north of us. Lancaster County has been fortunate to miss some of that, but the weather has been wacky here as it is all over. We've experienced this summer heat waves, heat indexes of 104 degrees for several days in a row. It's been blistering, uncomfortable, and concerning.
All right, great. Let's get going here. I want to get to your article, that outstanding piece that was published in Common Dreams. But before we do that, to kind of lay the groundwork, let's bring this up on screen. And this is from my friend Stephen Semler, who's been on podcast by George. And just based on what I've described, Brad, I mean, we need to address this. We need to spend some money. We need to have some focus on this thing that is going to wipe out humanity, this climate catastrophe. Here's what we're doing. This is the Climate Funding and the Inflation Reduction Act. It's 4% the size of the Pentagon budget. Stephen's very good with these graphics, with these charts. Here he's showing, look at this. This is in the current budget. $800 billion on the table. Under the table, you could make it probably an even $1 trillion. And then this little green piece down here. Good Lord. This is what we're spending on climate. And that's why these things are all interrelated, as I mentioned off of the top. The bombs get the money, the climate, the sea rise, the melting of the Greenland shelf, they get ignored, Brad.
They really do, and that graph sums it up so well. I mean, look at that. It's amazing. As you said, $1 trillion a year on national defense. President Biden's budget was about 754 billion. Congress threw in an extra 50 billion that wasn't even requested. When you factor in Department of Homeland Security and other agencies, you're easily up at $1 trillion a year. And then you look at what's being spent for climate, and it's a pittance. And the story that you just referenced about a 10-inch rise, think of the $1 trillion it's going to take to build seawalls around Manhattan to stop that water from coming in, around European capitals around the world. Those are trillions that could be spent for food insecurity, homelessness, everything else. But it's spent on war, and then it's going to be spent on building up to protect cities against climate change when all of this could have been avoided.
Yeah, and some of these horrific impacts are going to be felt, and it's kind of intimated in that article. It's going to happen, and we need to do something immediately to mitigate it as much as we possibly can. We can't stop it, but again, I mean, take a look at this. This is what we're doing. This again is from Steven Sembler. He says, so far, Biden has approved $40.13 billion in military assistance for the conflict in Ukraine from August of last year through August 2022. That's about $110 million per day on average. And here you can just go through this and you can see, and then you see these big green bars here. These are the big boondoggles. Boy, this is the big bucks that were spent, allocated by Congress. This is just the first top of this slide. And going on down here now to the present time, this is what he was putting in here. And again, this very graphically illustrates that we don't have our eye on the ball. We seem to be missing the point here almost entirely. And something has to be done. We've got to dig our heels in with the politicians, Democrats and Republican. I catch a lot of flack, Brad, from a lot of my, Democratic friends, a lot of my blue, no matter who, political acquaintances out there. I'm not in that camp anymore, but they tell us, that we've got to vote for these Democrats. And I'm saying, no, what we need to do, when you're contacted, like we all are all the time by these Democratic representatives to support them, tell them that you're not going to vote for them unless they do something. Do something. Don't talk about it as far as the climate is concerned. And then if you really want to strike fear in their hearts, Brad, I tell people to tell them you're not going to donate. You're not, because that's really why they're calling you. They want your vote, but they want your money. But we've got to start telling them that they're not going to get either one unless they address these issues we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's very true. I mean, the graphic that you just showed about the drawdowns that are going on for the aid to Ukraine that Biden's already allocated, this is wonderful news to the military-industrial complex, or what we call the blob. It's amazing how just as the Afghan war ends, the war in Ukraine starts. And this happens again and again. I've seen this over the decades. I was naive enough to believe at the end of the Cold War that we were really going to have a peace dividend. And lo and behold, Iraq comes along and Desert Storm, and then the war on terror. And now we're shifting back to a Cold War with Russia and China. And weapons manufacturers play a key role in this narrative. They drive the narrative. They're pushing it very hard. They own a lot of members of Congress who support these programs, and they're dictating foreign policy in a lot of ways. And it's very important to understand the mechanism behind this, because if we're going to change it, we have to recognize what we are up against. And a lot of ways I see that we are all members of the precariat right now. And the precariat is a term typically used in economics to describe this new class of workers who experience job insecurity. They're constantly on the hunt for new jobs or cobbling together several jobs to make a living. But I think it has meaning far beyond economics. The world is part of this precariat because we're sitting on a razor's edge of survival. And many of the safeguards, the guardrails that were in place, the CBMs, the confidence building measures that we had during the Cold War, they're gone. And we're out there and we're just rolling the dice that this is not going to blow up in our faces. And things are very dire right now. I haven't seen it this bad ever in my life. I've never read about it this bad. Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both Kennedy and Khrushchev knew that if a nuclear war occurred, there were no winners. I'm not so sure that's true anymore, because we have the advent and deployment of tactical nuclear weapons and the belief that a limited nuclear war could be fought. And that's a very scary thought.
Yeah, I've even seen some people say that, well, there's a nuclear missile used or something like that. It might take 3 years to recover from it, wherever that hits. I'm like, are you out of your mind? My God, do you think that one of these countries, one of these nations with nuclear weapons are just going to allow one to be fired into some area to take 3 years to recover from? No. It's going to start a nuclear holocaust. Just a few of these things. Matthew Ho talks about that on my podcast all the time. We'll create a nuclear winter that'll wipe us all out. And to your point here about how bad this is getting, this pretty clearly illustrates it. I want to play this film clip. It just takes, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds or so. This is another group that understands exactly where we're at on this thing. Watch this. Okay, so they ain't kidding. That's the bulletin of the atomic scientist. You heard Brad say that it's never been this bad. That's what they say too. We've never been 100 seconds from midnight, even in the Cuban Missile Crisis, like he was talking about. It wasn't anywhere near this bad. This is the precipice that we now find ourselves on. And what are we doing? We're agitating. We're sending these bombs and missiles and weapons into Ukraine instead of trying to find a way to resolve it through a negotiated peace settlement of some type. And I don't know. Here's something that I've been saying all along. And as a matter of fact, I've got a film clip when this first broke out, the Ukraine crisis, on my show about setting down for some type of a peace talk. Brad, are you surprised? Is this how far we've become servant to the military industrial complex that nobody's even tried, as far as I know, seriously to negotiate a ceasefire, let alone a peace settlement? I mean, every day that you have a ceasefire, even if it's shaky and not very good, results in fewer people being blown apart. But I don't hear anything, haven't heard anything about a ceasefire in Ukraine.
No, and there's little interest on the side of the United States to do that. It's in the interest of the United States to have Russia involved in a long, drawn-out war in Ukraine, to bleed them the way they were bled in Afghanistan during the 70s and 80s. We've embraced that as a policy. We don't necessarily want Ukraine to win quickly. We want this to be a long, drawn-out war that is going to tie the Russians down and is going to allow weapons manufacturers to sell vast sums of weapons, not only to Ukraine, but to all of Eastern Europe now. So a lot of these countries that were a little hesitant to arm up are now going to arm up as a result of this. And weapons manufacturers, US weapons manufacturers, have long been agitating to do this. So the idea of any kind of negotiated settlement is not in the interest of big business, the military industrial complex. They want this to go on. And you mentioned this military industrial complex, the blob. It used to be called the MIC. Now it's called the Mickey Mac. It's military industrial congressional entertainment information complex. It embraces all aspects of our culture. It has a stranglehold on our political and economic system. And we really need to understand that the narrative that we're getting from the media and from Pentagon officials and everything else is driven by this complex. Generals coming in and out of positions at the Pentagon, to positions in the White House, to positions on CNN, all have an interest in spinning a particular narrative, and that narrative is to sell weapons. So peace settlements are going to be difficult.
Well, and again, put this this chart back up on screen. What we're dealing here, as Similar points out, my God, this $800+ billion on the table, and with dark money and everything that's underneath the table, it's easily $1 trillion that we're spending annually renewable on the military budget. I tell people all the time, anybody that'll listen to me, and I found this out from the great Lee Camp, that $1 trillion, it boggles the mind, is a stack of $1,000 bills. We don't print them, folks. They're not, but if we did, it's a stack of $1,000 bills, 67 miles high. Each year, that's what we're spending on the military industrial complex. And what Brad was talking about, the generals, the first general that's most famous for warning about this influence was Dwight Eisenhower back in, when I was running around in short pants, for God's sake. I mean, that's how long that this has been going on and the situation that we're confronted with. Well, let me bring this up on screen because I want to get to this before we run out of time with Brad. He's an outstanding author. And this is the piece in Common Dreams. And this is the opening for it. And I would encourage everybody to go take a look at this. But the opening little subgraph here says, "The dance of sympathy on a planet gone mad. Working for peace and justice is not only the moral and right thing to do." God, does anybody argue with that? But is also a creative expression of what is to be human. An effort to eliminate war by bringing order to chaos and replacing violence with harmony. Now, this was written by Brad. This is last week, and it's been updated since then. In the White Mountains of New Hampshire, he writes, "I gathered last week with a group of anti-war activists where we talked of the grim issues confronting the globe: nuclear war, conventional war, drone war, climate catastrophe, American imperialism, and culture of militarism. The world is in a dire cataclysmic state. We are, it seems, a hairbreadth from annihilating ourselves." Remember that doomsday clock? That's what that is. And here, this really struck home to me. One speaker presented on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine that has come under shelling. It has 6 reactors. Any one of them, if hit by artillery, would explode with more destructive force than 10 Chernobyls combined. And I don't know, Matt, maybe one of the only silver lining to silver cloud to the Chernobyl thing was it was kind of out in the boonies. This would be in the heart of Ukraine, one of the most beautiful countries, the breadbasket of the world. One time, I think, the breadbasket of Russia. Now, if they aren't hit by shelling, the power grid keeping the nuclear rods cooled could be knocked offline by shelling in the area. Okay, Brad, so tell us what happens if those cooling rods get knocked offline just by shelling nearby.
So this particular plant, it's the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. And I wrote that article early last week. And since then, the plant was knocked offline on Thursday. So shelling did take out the power grid temporarily. And they had to go to backup generators in order to get the water flowing and cool the rods. So that's already happened. Those plants are not designed to be in battleground areas. They are designed to withstand a lot of issues, technical glitches, have fail-safe measures for the normal running of the plant, but not for soldiers inside the plant carrying guns and grenades and trucks parked outside the plant with large munitions. So if a weapon discharges inside the plant and causes a fire and shuts down the power grid there, or if a truck outside the plant explodes and causes an issue with the power grid, then those nuclear rods cannot be cooled. You have a meltdown and you have this disaster like we had in Chernobyl, except 10 times to the effect. So it's a very dangerous, precarious situation. And it just adds to the sense of insecurity that we have, this global insecurity that we have. It's not just nuclear war, but these nuclear power plants are in the middle of battle zones. And we have to be cognizant of that fact. I know the AEI did send a team in, I believe, today to try to take a look at it. They are very concerned about the nature of that plant and what could happen if it gets knocked offline.
Now, is that UN agency? I brought this slide up on
It is.
screen. Okay, so this
That's the
reason
agency. Yep.
To inspect it. Okay, so they're in there taking a look at it. And this is Dateline Kiev. A UN nuclear watchdog team set off an urgent mission yesterday, actually, to safeguard the Russian-occupied atomic power plant at the heart of fighting in Ukraine. A long-awaited trip the world hopes will help avoid a radioactive catastrophe. You know, I think of these nuclear bombs. My God, it may just come from a nuclear power plant. The stakes couldn't be higher for the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's that acronym that Brad used. Experts who will visit the plant in a country where the 1986 Chernobyl disaster spewed radiation throughout the region, shocking the world and intensifying a global push away from global energy. So they're having drills that reflect increasing defense ties between Moscow and Beijing, which has grown stronger since Russia sent its troops into Ukraine on February 24th. China has pointedly refused to criticize Russia's action, blaming the U.S. and NATO for provoking Moscow, and has blasted punishing sanctions imposed on Moscow. Okay, so Brad, talk about that a little bit, because you talked about this stupid strategy that we have, which has failed, most notably in recent history, both in Afghanistan and Syria, to push Russia into some kind of a quagmire that will harm Russia. But actually, what this is doing, it appears to me like, is pushing Russia into the arms of China, and further, or vice versa, and further exacerbating this world at war that is increasing.
Yeah, it is. We keep making these policy mistakes of doing exactly what is not in our interest. And so when we push Russia and China closer together, along with India, we're talking about half the world's population joining together in an alliance that is against what we would say are Western interest. And it's being done by our own military provocations. So we just concluded the RIMPAC military exercises in the Pacific that concluded August 4th. That's the Rim of the Pacific military exercise with Great Britain and Australia and 28 other countries. It's the largest military exercise in the world, happens every 2 years, and it's all designed to do war games against an attack against China or a battle against China. So we do these war games. They're fine from our perspective. They're not provocative. They're meant to keep the sea lanes open, et cetera. But then when we see Russia and China doing them, it's a terrible thing. It's a provocative measure, and we need to respond. So, we keep working up this ladder of escalation to the point where the compression time, what they call the attack response time, gets compressed to the point where an accident, a miscalculation, an unknown factor can trigger a conventional war that will quickly lead to a nuclear war. So whether it's the exercises between Russia and China, which are very concerning, or the exercises that we have in RIMPAC, are equally concerning from the eyes of China and Russia. When these countries are looking out from their lens, say China, they're seeing 200 American military bases surrounding them. Now, if America would look out and see Chinese military bases in the Caribbean, or say China trying to take control of Panama and preventing our goods and military weapons moving from the East Coast to the West Coast, we would be hysterical. We've declared that the Western Hemisphere is ours and nobody comes in. But we freely exercise military games off the coast of China, something we would never tolerate.
Yeah, we've got them surrounded. I've got this graphic here. I mean, it doesn't bear a lot of explanation. This,
There you go.
God, these are the U.S. military installations bases. There's 800 in some of them. Again, Matthew Ho will tell you that there's more than that. It's approaching 1,000 around the planet. And we mentioned China and Russia. If I were to put the map up of their military installations, I mean, you would laugh out loud. This is who we are, folks. This is what we are doing. Instead of addressing the climate situation that we talked about earlier, which is going to get us all, if this doesn't first, through a nuclear strike accidentally or on purpose, or in a nuclear power plant meltdown. Okay, so I want to just finish up with this. Russia, in turn, has strongly backed China amid the tensions of the U.S. that followed a recent visit to Taiwan by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Speaking earlier this month, Russian President Vladimir Putin drew parallels between U.S. support for Ukraine and Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, charging that both were part of alleged American efforts to foment global instability. Okay, so that's Putin saying that. And people would say, okay, well, that's Putin. I mean, he's Russian. That guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. That's propaganda. Wait a second. This is from the Associated Press. This is July 20th. This is just a couple of weeks ago. Biden, the military says a Pelosi Taiwan trip, not a good idea, folks. And of course, that's since happened. And fortunately, China hasn't retaliated. Maybe in some ways they are retaliating, but we haven't seen any armed conflict because of it. But again, I look at the credibility of Putin and I think, well, you got to look at him with a jaundiced eye. But here Biden is, Brad, agreeing with him.
Yeah, it's strange. I would point out regarding Putin that, we demonize these people who are against Western interests. So Putin is a dangerous military madman, according to the narrative. And he wants to occupy Ukraine because he has this delusions of grandeur, of being Peter the Great, and
Yeah.
unifying all of that. We always do this with people. We don't say that they have strategic concerns about an area the way we do. We try to say that they're irrational in their thinking. President Xi wants to occupy Taiwan because he too is seeking the greater glory of his country. Well, when you say that, then you can't appeal to reason with those people. You can only fight them militarily. So that's a common narrative that we need to be aware of. This trip to Taiwan by Pelosi was unnecessary. It had no strategic merit. There was nothing to be accomplished other than a showing for Pelosi and to try to poke the Chinese in the eye, which is very dangerous. Taiwan and China are in a very difficult situation there. We're running our warships through the Straits of Taiwan all the time. And, why aggravate the matter? Why not try to seek some kind of mutual understanding there? I think that the article of mine that you mentioned, and I mentioned sort of this dance of sympathy and a reference to the
Yeah, I want to get
arts.
to that.
Yeah, I mean, the arts, to me, the arts represent the best of us, right? This is the best that we can be. This is us at our most imaginative and creative. And so I'll often come back to music and literature and poetry when I look at these, issues in the world and the grim conditions we're facing, because I think, well, we are capable of doing these incredibly beautiful, imaginative works of art. And that shows that we appreciate and value life and that we want to live. And the vast majority of the people want to survive. But a handful of people at the top don't share that same interest. They're willing to engage in high risk behavior that jeopardizes all of us. And until we withdraw the power that we've given to them in democratic societies or even totalitarian societies, until we withdraw that power from them, they're going to continue to play these games and put our lives at risk. So we do have to unite. We do have to understand that we have tremendous power. And through solidarity, we can make these changes. But the blob is very good at atomizing us. It's very good at saying you are an individual. If you speak out, you will lose your job. You will go to jail. You'll be vilified. They don't want us to unite. So they pit us against each other in culture wars, issues over religion, even different forms of Christianity, whatever they can find to divide us, keep us occupied so we don't look at them walking away with the nation's wealth. They're happy with that, regardless of the high risk games they play in the world.
Well,
So,
here, yeah, and what I would say, going back to Eisenhower, as I mentioned earlier, they've gotten very good at it. I mean, they're very effective at it. Eisenhower saw it kind of at its beginnings, coming out of World War II, and when he talked about that as he left office, in the 50s, late 50s or whatever. My God, think of how proficient they have gotten at that endeavor since then. I want to bring this back up on screen now, because there were a couple of things here in your article that I thought. Were great. I talk about on my podcast once in a while. I don't think it's getting enough coverage. You mentioned at this meeting up in New Hampshire, we also spoke of hypersonic missiles, which fly at 5 times the speed of sound, low flying and evasive, and thus cannot be detected by radar, making it a highly destabilizing instrument of war. The deployment of tactical nuclear warheads to be used as part of a conventional attack under the absurd assumption that a limited nuclear war can be fought, and the $1.5 trillion to be spent on modernizing the U.S. nuclear force, rebuilding every leg of the nuclear triad. Now, I wanted to talk about these hypersonic missiles a little bit, Brad, because I saw a former UN weapons analyst, and he was talking about the fact that some of the stuff that we're sending into Ukraine has the ability to fire hypersonic missiles. I don't know whether or not they have those missiles, but if they did and they were to fire one at Russia, here's what he said would happen. Those missiles fired from Ukraine would only take about 5 minutes to hit any place in Russia. That gives the generals, that gives the people in Russia, and who knows what the hell they're doing in the middle of the night? Who knows how much vodka they've consumed? Who knows what the hell their mindset might be? It gives them 5 minutes to decide what to do. And if it's aimed at a target where their command and control is, it would be viewed as a decapitation strike with these hypersonic missiles. That means they are mandated. They have military protocol written down that's known. They have to respond accordingly with nuclear weapons. And if the hypersonic missiles were successful, let's say they actually went in before they could do anything in 5 minutes and destroyed their command and control. He said the Russians have what's called dead hand technology, that their missiles would fire regardless of how effective we were or how effective Ukraine or NATO was at destroying command and control in Russia. And he said what he warned about, the thing that terrified him the most, were these hypersonic missiles that you're writing about.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the guardrails have been removed with the development of these new technologies. And hypersonic missiles, they come in two forms. There's the hypersonic cruise missile, which is basically a ballistic missile flying at Mach 5. And then there's the hypersonic glide missiles, which can fly at speeds of up to Mach 20. It's 20 times the speed of sound. And they can change direction at the last minute. So you don't know where they're heading until the last minute. And it used to be that when ICBMs were launched from the Soviet Union in the 50s, it would take hours to get here. So there was that amount of reaction time. And then those hours were reduced to an hour, to 30 minutes, to 15 minutes, to 6 minutes. And it's really unrealistic to think that President Biden or any military commander anywhere in the world is going to have the capability to respond to a perceived nuclear attack in 6 minutes. So they create these dead hand or automated nuclear computerized responses. It's basically AI that they're using. And the Soviets actually adopted this. It was known as perimeter in the 1980s. They employed this computerized response. And what happens is the computerized, in the case of a nuclear attack, it becomes automated. And they will do a scan to see if there's anybody in the military leadership left alive, say in America or in the Soviets, at that time, the Soviet Union. If the computers determine that there's nobody in military command left alive, they will scan the land to see if a nuclear attack has occurred, and then they will launch all remaining nuclear missiles. So it all becomes automated at that point. That's something that we are moving forward to. So the Russians said they took that offline, but we have no guarantee that they did that. We've asked them, their response has basically been, it's none of your business. Whether we have such an AI automated response in place, who knows? Who knows at this point? But again, when you start compressing the reaction time to just minutes, you've got to determine, this is a missile. Is it nuclear tipped? Who fired it? Where is it heading? What kind of damage is it going to do? And am I going to respond? It's irrational to think that you can do that in that short of amount of time. And when you read these papers that are written about this, the analysts, they get very lost in the weeds in this thing. They talk about a preemptive strike that could occur in America that would take the hardline communications offline. And then it would switch to softline communications. And what they're talking about in that initial strike is 100 million Americans that have just died.
God.
But then we go to softline, as if there's a sense of survival after that point. The remaining 250 million Americans are living in conditions that we cannot even conceive of. Civilization has ended. It's tribal survival at that point. There's no food, there's no power, there's no electric, there's no service, there's no law and order. But, they just continue to develop these technologies. There's money in them. And I really think that they don't step back the way citizens, the way you and I do, and say, this is insane. This is mad. This is really mad. I didn't vote to give you the power to destroy me and the world. And we need to step back from this.
Yeah, that's the beast part of this. Let's talk a little bit more about this beauty that you mentioned. You said, is it basically, is anybody going to do anything about this? And you said, no, it's just us, random groups of citizens around the world trying to save our species from extinction. You said that your mind reeled, spun. I eventually found footing in the reassuring fields of art, poetry, music, and beauty. You said you thought of dance. You mentioned that, the dance of sympathy. And this is great. I mean, because, man, we need some optimism here, because these things that we're talking about are horrible, horrific things. But your feeling is that there's an essence in humanity and kind of our fundamental, the sympathy of dance. Talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned it briefly, but explain that.
Sure. So the dance of sympathy is the idea that our bodies respond in sympathetic connection to music, regardless of culture or background. There's something about music and the beauty of music that makes us have a sympathetic connection with us. And that means that we are attached, humanity, across all borders and across all countries. And it's not just dance, but we respond the same way when we hear poetry, we see a painting, a sculpture. The arts have the ability to let us cross these borders. And to me, that does speak that we're all brothers and sisters, that we're all in this together, and that we all are capable of either creating great beauty as artists or appreciating the beauty that artists create. That gives me hope. It really does. It says that there is an element of not just survival, but an element of the appreciation of beauty in humanity. And if that's the case, then we can stop this spiral towards death. We can stop this spiral towards destroying ourselves. We can take the power out of the hands of those people and put it in the hands of people who appreciate life, who value life, and want to spend those trillions of dollars to enhance the quality of life. Because you do have to ask yourselves, when you showed those graphs of trillions of dollars being spent,
Yeah.
what did it buy us? What did 20 years of war on terror and $16 trillion buy us? We're not more safe. We killed an awful lot of people, created tremendous suffering across the world, whipped up anti-Americanism to a degree that we've never known before. These people have failed who are in control. They have failed at everything they set out to do in terms of protecting us and enhancing our quality of life.
Yeah.
And we've got to recognize that. We've got to join together and stand up and organize.
And Brad's point, what did this get us? Did this make us more safe? Did this prevent the war in Ukraine? Is this preventing the world sitting on the brink of a nuclear holocaust with 100 seconds to midnight on the doomsday clock? No, it actually exacerbated it. And it's even worse than that. It talks about the interconnectivity that I mentioned at the beginning of the show. The climate, all these military bases that you see, almost 1,000 of them around the planet, the U.S. military is the largest institutional polluter and emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, larger than most nations, big nations that you're familiar with, even NATO countries. The U.S. military exceeds all of that. And again, the big three on podcast by George. It's all a web, Brad. It's climate, war, and of course the reason that we can't afford to heal ourselves with healthcare is because we're spending money on the military industrial complex, or that blob that you talked about.
Yeah, we are, and it's a shame. Not only is the United States military the greatest institutional polluter in the world in terms of a carbon footprint, but they create more hazardous materials than any other institution in the world. They've created what are known as forever chemicals, which you've probably heard. They are literally around forever. You cannot get rid of them.
Yes, PFAS. We've had that on the show.
Okay, there you go. And military bases here in America, in the United States, like Camp Lejeune, they're just one giant hazmat site. Soldiers they've got cancer, they've got all kinds of illnesses as a result of training down there. So, and that doesn't mention the dollars that are taken away from climate that are given to the military. So, as you said, you've got the military, you've got climate, and then healthcare, education, everything else in terms of quality of life being left out over here. We're supposed to elect these people to take care of us and provide us with a quality of life, but they're just allowing us to be robbed blind. They're allowing people to walk off with the nation's wealth, shifting the burden of running the state in terms of finances to just working class people. And then they're making life extremely dangerous as we sit on this razor's edge of survival.
Well, go to Common Dreams and read this article by Brad. I want to wrap it up here. The last paragraph kind of says it all. Yeah, read Brad and then go read Noam Chomsky, Manufacturing Consent, because what he's speaking of, that's exactly what Chomsky is talking about here. Now, Brad wraps up here by saying, as a member of these scattered random groups of dissident peacemakers, we try to do the same, practicing our nonviolent art, writing our saving works, using hopeful artistry to bring order to chaos and lead us through these dark, cataclysmic days so that love lurches on, cleansing, healing, restoring. May we all rise, cross our invented borders. Yeah, that's the other thing, these lines on a map, folks, and meet in sympathetic connection. May we all be poets and peacemakers, ending this planetary madness. That's just a great way to wrap it up. It made me think of that passage in the Bible about blessed be the peacemakers. I mean, it's a great ending, and there's reason for optimism. But I'm bringing this up on Brett. This is what I think of sometimes when I think of the military. I look at this in Live Science. Chimps kill, mutilate, and cannibalize members of their own group. Folks, that's how I think of us a lot of times. Brad thinks of the sympathy of the dance and the good part of humanity and the fact that it's going to pull us out of here. I look at this and think, my God, are we like chimps? We're pretty close to them on a DNA basis, as I understand. But that's certainly the way that we've been behaving of late. And we got to stop it. And we got to focus on what's real and what's going to get us before anything else does. And I think it's going to be, I'm trending towards climate. Actually, for a while, I thought it would be some type of an accidental nuclear strike, because when you look at this map, Brad, and again, I've brought this up several times. Look, do you think an accident might happen? Do you think somebody might accidentally do something that could trigger a response that would end it all? I look at that and think, my God, that is Murphy's Law waiting to happen, Brad.
It is. It really is. It's a very scary scenario. And we can't be afraid to use words like beauty and love in our conversation.
Yes.
And also in what we're asking of our elected officials. There's sort of a macho military militant component going on right now. But human nature is about beauty and love. And we're all supposed to be getting along. We can get along. I believe that with every fiber of my being. And I think that we need to work to enact that in every way that we can.
Well, we're running out of time here. We're going to have to let Brad go. But here's a point that I bring up all the time on the show. And again, news, blues, and interviews. We've talked about music, dance, the arts, that type of thing. I would like to call on filmmakers in Hollywood to kind of go the opposite direction. A lot of this, what he's describing, this goofball, macho perspective, this violence-oriented view of the world, it was promulgated by, the John Wayne movies of yesteryear. I would like to have, the film idols that people look up to and apparently are greatly paying attention to. Think Ronald Reagan, think Donald Trump as an example. I would like to have those people, on the left or on the rational side of Hollywood, start making movies and start making pronouncements exactly what you're talking about. Have them talk about the dance, Brad.
That would be wonderful. I scan the different streaming services that we have each night, looking for something about that. They're all action movies. They're violent. Very difficult to find things. I usually end up with documentaries, watching documentaries and things like that. But Hollywood plays a big role in this. The recent Top Gun movie, that script was pretty much written by the Pentagon. Yeah. That was one giant propaganda film for military recruitment, and too many of them are. They're promoting violence, they're promoting the military, they're promoting war as a solution, glorifying war heroes. And there needs to be more movies about the peacemakers, about Eugene Debs, about Martin Luther King and Gandhi and all these other individuals. Yeah, there's one or two out there, but not the way there are about military heroes. So instead of glorifying war and having banners in every small town of veterans, we need to have banners up of peacemakers, people who have really worked for peace. And you can look at Philip Berrigan and Daniel Berrigan and Dorothy Day and a whole litany of people that dedicated their entire lives to making peace. It's just as brave. It's brave. It's more courageous than going to war. It really is, because they're standing out there saying no continually over the decades to violence and war. And that's what we are here for.
Yeah, and we had a conversation about this on the podcast just recently, but I don't think you can overstate the significance of it. I'd like to see people like, Denzel and The Rock, Clint Eastwood isn't going to do it any longer, and he's probably too old to anyway. But I'd like for him to come out and say, that gunplay that's in my movies, that's play. I mean, that's not what these guns are for, how they should be used. If you're a man, if you're a macho guy, if you aspire to my character in a movie, you don't settle it at the point of a gun or at the point of a missile. Really, when it comes right down to it, that's sociopathic. That's not manly at all. That's not what I'm about. that's for selling movie tickets. I'd love to have somebody come out and say that and start addressing it in that fashion. And that's for movies that have already been made, probably, and then start making the type of films that you're talking about. That would be great. Well, we've digressed a little bit here at the end, Brad. I want to give you last word. I mean, this has been a great conversation. Love having you on the show. We went through a lot of slides, talked about a lot of things, and I want to encourage everybody to follow you at World Beyond War, the Progressive, Common Dreams, places where your writings appear. But give us a little close here, something that you want to talk about that we didn't discuss very much, or maybe not at all.
Well, I would encourage us all to recognize that we have the ability to be peacemakers and to change this narrative. I think there's a blasé attitude among folks right now that you really can't do anything, so I'm better off just going to work, remaining silent, maybe not looking at the grim news that's confronting the world. That is not an answer. That is a direction for disaster. So I would say be hopeful, recognize that you have enormous power in solidarity with other people. And we need to group together because we've done this before. In the 1960s, we ended a war. That had never happened in America before. So we ended a war in Vietnam. We ended segregation. In the 1930s, the labor movement was formed. They got tremendous rights for workers. We've grouped together in union before. We can do it again, and we can do it across borders in a way that ends this military madness. So I really do want to end on a note of hope that has a very forceful and strong call to action. We cannot sit on the sidelines. We really have to get out there and do this. And we have to do it now. There's not time.
It's
There's
100
no
seconds.
time.
100 seconds to midnight, folks. I mean, we can't wait any longer. We need to quit sending weaponry into Ukraine for a war that's going to take decades to get over with and push the world powers to the brink of nuclear disaster. That's what he's talking about. There's no doubt in my mind that that is absolutely correct. And yeah, that's well said. Brad, thanks again for coming on Podcast by George, this edition of the Live Line. We'll have you back here very soon, and I hope the news is better overall. I hope we're doing the sympathy dance and that we're not being a chimp.
I hope not either. And thank you so much for having me. Your show is wonderful. You're doing a great service to your listeners and to everybody. So more power to you, George. Thank you.
Well, that's a little bit of what I can do, and I appreciate that. And again, my parting salvo to people would be when those candidates, and most likely the Democrats, that's what you're going to be able to have the most success with. Like I tell people, the Republican Party's jumped off the right side of the political platform onto the crazy train. They've gone over the horizon. They ain't coming back. When those Democratic candidates contact you, they want your vote. They want your money. Tell them you want peace. You want a resolution of the climate change. You want the big three to be addressed, as I bring up on Podcast by George all the time. And that would be climate, war, and healthcare. Okay, well, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's great. Brad, we'll talk again very soon.
Thank you. Take care.
And folks, if you like Podcast by George, my parting statement always is go to podcastbygeorge.com. That's my webpage, and it's the easiest place to pick the most convenient platform for you to get these shows and see folks like Brad Wolf. On Facebook and YouTube, you can watch the videos and the live lines. That all you got to do is just give us a thumbs up, like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, ring that notification bell, give us a thumbs up there. Or if you like the audio only portions, particularly for long live lines like this, because it was a great topic today, those are available on iTunes and Spotify and the iHeartRadio app and Amazon Prime, all kinds of places. Those little icons are on podcastbygeorge.com as well. Click one, you can subscribe, and then on your phone or your PC or laptop or whatever, you'll be notified each time a new podcast is released. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.